ourselves alone, their battle cry, and freedom rise to that Easter sky. They were the men with the vision, the men with the cause, the men unified their oppressors' laws, the men who traded change for guns, born into slavery they were freedom's sons. The poet's dream had sparked a flame, a raging fire it soon became, and from the fire of destiny arose a nation proud and free. They were the men with the vision, the men with the cause, the men unified their oppressors' laws, the men who traded change for guns, born into slavery they were freedom's sons. 6 counties lay in bondage still, they died great men, was this their will, until we're free and oppression cease, only then great men can sleep in peace. They were the men with the vision, the men with the cause, the men unified their oppressors' laws, the men who traded in change for guns, born into slavery they were freedom's sons. Born into slavery they were freedom's sons.
Ernie O'Malley was a very significant figure in the War of Independence and in the Civil War. He was a medical student in 1916 and fired a few shots at the occupation forces with a Mauser gun lent to him by a friend. When he got out of the internment after suffering from wounding, torture and hunger in 1924, he spent 2 years travelling in Europe in an effort to recover his health. He wandered around the United States and New Mexico for a further 7 years before returning to Ireland to marry an American artist, Helen Hooker. They settled in Ireland and had 3 children, one of whom, Cormac, we are greatly honoured to have here this evening. Cormac was born here, but he went to live with his mother in the United States after Ernie's death in 1957. After attending Harvard College and serving with the U.S. Navy and completing Columbia Law School, Cormac worked for 40 years in international legal practice while living in Mexico, London, and New York. Over the past 30 years, Cormac has helped preserve his father's literary and historical image, republishing his father's earlier works On Another Man's Wound and The Singing Flame. He has contributed in no small way to historical research and has co-edited 2 volumes of his father's letters. His own book, Western Ways, appeared in 2015. In 2016, Cormac edited Modern Ireland and Ernie O'Malley in Context. Cormac now lives in a place called Stonington in Connecticut. And now, without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Cormac O'Malley.
I wanted to say, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. And my father's life, basically, and give you sort of an overview, not so much in detail of the period I know that some of you are very interested in, which is the 1916 to 21. You probably have read far more than I of that period, but I'll certainly cover it. I thought I might spend my time covering a period which you don't know about, which is the rest of the life of Ernie O'Malley. And so I really wanted to sort of cover that in general. He was born, the O'Malley family lived in Mayo, and his father was brought up in Ellison Street in Castlebar. This is in 1895 or shot. He was born in 1897, quite close to this. And later on, here's on the left, the house that he was raised in Castlebar. When they moved up to Dublin, they had a substantially more significant house in Glasnevin. These were the redoubtable Malley family, and the name of the family is Malley and not O'Malley. But he continued, after that, he continued to take the name Ernie O'Malley rather than Ernest Bernard Malley, as he would have been born with. But the Malley is very important in Father's life, because in fact, the opening pages of On Another Man's Wound, and somebody loaned me the book for the evening, starts off with his, how do you start writing a book about Ireland and telling the story of the Revolution? Father made it very personal. Our nurse, Nanny, told my oldest brother and me stories and legends. Her stories began, once upon a time, and a very good time it was, and ended with, they put on the kettle and made tea, and if they were not happy, that you may. And he introduces stories and legends from the very first page of this book about the folklore of Ireland, the Tuatha Dé Danann of Holland, and reminding people who was going to read this that legend in Ireland is important, mythology is important, and what you need to do to get a national spirit is to build up on that. And that was the reason. But further on in the books you'll see that there are 31 songs included in this book, because songs are the element of what people sing and rejoice and tell their stories. And so this is a book about his life, is how he felt about Ireland. It was not his parents. His parents, as he said, did not have any national faith. Again, these are middle-class parents down the country, living across from the RIC station in a conservative community. Everything is quite happy. They may or may not have been interested in home rule, but in Castlebar, the city town, the state, the center of the county, they were making a nice living and not worried too much about what was going on outside. Certainly not in terms of nationalism. So the folklore that he got from the Nanny is really very critical when you think of Father's later life, how he does go back in the 40s. He explores folklore in Mayo, and that is very. And wherever he goes around the world, he goes to Mexico, he's into folklore. He goes into New Mexico, he's into folklore. Because what he finds, again, the essence of what people are is reflections of things around them. At least they should be. It was also down in County Mayo that he got his love of mountains and the sea. And you'll find out throughout his letter writings and other activities, as he does later on, that Clú Bay, the themes of the water, are very meaningful to him. And I found Nanny's name, Mary Ann Jordan, in the census of 1901. And the poem that he tells about Mary Ann is how she taught him the songs and the rhythms, and how to listen to the birds, and what the nuances of the language were, and how the fairies came again. So again, this was the language which he, in inherited and absorbed. And no doubt it was from her that he would have come up with this statement he has on another man's room, that he felt that he had the inborn hate of things English, which I expect all Irishmen inherit. King was my objective. I hated him, and I blamed him for all the things that no, these were the early days of Ernie O'Malley's life. So the family moved to Dublin in 1906. The O'Malley family is quite typical of many families in Dublin at the time. Two brothers go to join the British Army. Remember, 1914, John Redmond says, "Serve your country, go fight the Hun." And a lot of Irish volunteers did that. And also people who were just getting out of school, like Frank Malley, getting a job in a well-paid job in the British Army wasn't that bad. 1916 hadn't occurred, wasn't in the imagination of the Malley family that could occur. And even if it did, God knows you can't answer that question. But they signed up for employment. So two brothers, a younger and an older brother, went off to the British Army, fought in the Connaught Rangers and died in Africa. The next generation within father's spectrum are four brothers, Cecil, Paddy, Kevin, and Charlie, all joined in the Irish Volunteers or the IRA at one point, and Charlie dies in the middle of the Civil War. The rest are younger. So, how come Ernie O'Malley doesn't join the Irish Volunteers or isn't participating in Irish history? Hey, he's keeping his head down, got a scholarship, got to UCD, didn't have the issue that his older brother had to decide what he was going to be because he had a scholarship. So he was there in UCD when the 1916 occurs. And just before 1916 occurs, about 3 or 4 weeks before, Major John McBride comes to the Malley household and asks my father what was he going to do, and my father responded that he might join the British Army, and John McBride says to him, "No, you won't." I thought that was a sort of a signal that John McBride knew what was going to happen. Turns out John McBride didn't know what was going to happen. Where he was at that time, he made a summary in the introduction to Another Man's Room. He says, "My attitude to the fight is that of a sheltered individual, drawn from the secure seclusion of Irish life to the responsibility of action." The feeling and what Father does in terms of taking action in 1916. Because in 1916, he has what I refer to as an epiphany. He's coming down to medical school, even though it's a Monday morning and it's a holiday, must be meeting some friends actually fairly close to here. As you may or may not know, the UCD Medical School was about 2 blocks from here on Celia Street. So he was coming down to get away from the family and have a bit of a holiday. I guess at the time that he came down, there must have been nothing going on at Nelson's Pillar. But by the time 2 or 3 o'clock that he went back, he heard a lot of commotion, and he went round and he read the proclamation. I saw a copy of the proclamation. Part of the words that he read in the proclamation was that Ireland should be for the Irish. Nothing remarkable in those words now. I mean, why wouldn't it be? But for a young man in his position, seeing that people had taken action based upon the essence of what this document is, which is Ireland should be for the Irish alone, and that the Irish should have their own sovereignty and should rule themselves. He felt shocked to the core, and he decided not to go join some of his friends who had invited him at Trinity College to, that was a bit of a laugh, let's get a gun and defend our place. And he said, no, the O'Malley family said you had to be home for tea. So fortunately, he was saved by a cup of tea. But he had to go home because Mrs. O'Malley would have sent the troops out to get his son in if he didn't get home for tea on time. And throughout his life as a student, he had to be home for tea. He could climb out the window afterward and go home for tea. And on the way home, he met a fellow student who happened to be an art student, yay for the arts. And they said he started talking about possibly fighting for Trinity, defending Trinity. And they said, why would you do that? Trinity is not us. You would be shooting your own people. And he went home and learned his lesson and went out that night with somebody else. As Tim Doyle said, took up the gun and joined in the force. Not in an organized way. He wasn't doing what the Irish Volunteers had done, made a commitment, had their battalions out. But Ernie O'Malley, going back to that point that I said where he was taking the responsibility of action. Upon reflection, so Ernie O'Malley's getting into that he needs to do action. And I found a note which I want to read here now, which he wrote back in the mid-20s, but it sort of gets his spirit. He was trying to explain to a lady why he was so disaffected and not able to have good relationships with people generally. Now, when Ernie O'Malley says something that's tough, you better believe that means tough. Because by that time, in 1924, he had had a pretty tough 8 years when you summarize it. Now, we have another word in medical terms for it today, called PTSD, and certainly that was post-traumatic stress syndrome. Many of you have relatives who have gone through the 1916 and subsequent period. Some of them are pretty ornery, some of them didn't have good relations with social relations. It was tough. These people went through real trauma and their relationships were very difficult. Anyway, so back in 1916, Father makes a decision to take some action. Obviously, he doesn't tell his family, but he has a wink and a nod with people at the university, and he says the university life has changed forever with him. Because as he got that wink and a nod, and he says that there weren't too many, I don't know what the historians do as to the number of UCD graduates who were participating in nationalist causes at the time. Father's view was it wasn't that many, and he sort of needed to seek them out. But you do seek people out. You go to the Cayleys, you start learning Irish, you start raising funds for those who are interned, you start volunteering in different things, so you see those people who you have an inclination for and become friends. So he goes back to the university and he meets these people, doesn't study much, is sort of committed to where he's going to go, thinks that what the future might be, doesn't quite know how to get there. Joins the Irish Volunteers probably in September or December of 1917, and attends, again, climbs out of the window after the dinners with the family at 6 o'clock, goes down to Parnell Square where the meetings were, does his relatively desultory sort of activities. The training at this time is not particularly enlightening or good, but it is an effort. It is volunteers. They are trying to do what they do. By the time he started in 1918, he finally sort of said, okay, enough's enough. I need to do this full time. He goes on the run in 1918. He comes down. His name is passed along. He comes into the headquarters at the time. Reports to Michael Collins and Richard Morcatti, who are trying to organize. By 1921, there are 65 battalions. 65 brigades. And the headquarters doesn't have a clue what they're doing. They're all independent brigades. Guys, this is not a way to run a revolution. You cannot run a revolution with 65 independent brigades all acting in their own sense of what they might do. So you need to create, and what Mulcahy and Collins did, created divisions. So they put the brigades into 16 divisions. That made sense. And they got a good leader with management to run those divisions. Father, age 23, was made a division commander, age 23. So organizing a revolution, the question that management had at headquarters was, how do you organize these people, these country people, these good people, but they are country people. They are mostly farmers, and even if they're not farmers, they're sons of usually sort of middle class and lower middle class, trying to figure out, make an army of them. So Father is an organizer, and he goes around organizing. Now what does an organizer do? He's a pain in the ass. He comes into a local town like Tullamore or Offaly, and he calls the brigade people together, battalion OCs, gets them to march up and down. I said, what are we doing? This isn't creating a revolution. So they don't understand discipline, attention to detail. How do you burn out an RIC barracks? Someone has to get the petrol, someone has to get the ladder, someone has to get organized, someone has to cut the wires, that's organization. So it took great difficulty and attention. I know as a fact he could not make a speech like I'm doing. Even reading, he failed. But he was passionate, and he was able to do it more on a one-on-one, not in a global sense of addressing people. But because eventually he had done so many things, people respected not his charisma, but his presence and his style, and he became a heroic image because of his action. So, and he goes around. He's in Tyrone, Offaly, Westmeath, Roscommon, Galway, Leitrim, Dublin. He writes back to Saoirse Plunkett. Collins sends him up there. He says, they're not doing anything in Finland, what should we do? And so here we are, near Dublin, not too far away from where we are. And Father writes back, dissolve the brigade, start over again. And then later he goes on to Donegal, Clare, tries to go out to the Aran Islands, and that doesn't work out very well. Tells a lot of good stories on Aran. The success on Aran is really not due to his stories, but due to the fact that he has Clancy from Clare translate his own folklore stories. And Father took great pride in hearing that there was folk tales of the Nordic and Eric the Red and Halkut and other stories that he had read and absorbed in his own. And he found that the people in Aran related to that. It was related to the fishing, the heroics of common people in regular daily life, of the routine that they do. And folklore is built upon these types of stories. He went on to other, in 1920s, again in Dublin, Monaghan, Tipperary, East Limerick, back in Dublin again, in North Cork. Now, Mallow is an interesting case. There were not too many of these incidents were what you call raging rallies. They were either holding up the RIC or a small troop of British troops that were going from A to B, and the brigade battalion, the flying column comes, and they know they're going to go around a corner and get an ambush. And Mallow was quite a different. It was I think the only major regiment building that was captured during the War of Independence. And in that incident, Father was the man who went up and knocked on the door with a letter for the commanding officers, and he showed it to the man. And the sentry looked at it and had to open the gate. And the minute they opened the gate, my father put the hand in, put the safety lock onto the gun, and handed him the the lever and then turn the gun on. That takes a certain amount of courage. And I guess, as Father writes about it, he didn't want to delegate that responsibility for his own death. It should occur to somebody else. He also didn't want to have it be messed up, and he knew by this time that he could do it. So he wasn't the only soldier doing it, but he was the front man who went up and did the action. When you think about the action, that was pretty heroic. You open the gate, and all of his own, the IRA fellows come in. Liam Lynch was, in fact, the commander of that brigade area at the time. And shortly after there, it's a long story, he got captured in Kilkenny, questioned, he brought up to Dublin Castle here, he got worked over by Major and Captain Harding, bayonets on his, being asked simple questions: who are you, what are you doing, where did you get the gun, because he was caught with guns down in Kilkenny. He didn't tell them much. He got fairly well beaten up. But they didn't get any information out of him. They put blank pistol with blanks on his head and shot him, but it was blank, so he wasn't shot. Still, a threat like that is enough to make you collapse, as he did. Anyway, they didn't get anything out of him. He was very young. I mean, at this time, he's still only 22, and they had no idea who he was. But in the later edition of On Another Man's Wound, Eileen McGrane's apartment on 12 Grafton Street was raided on December 30th. And there was the handwriting. They knew of Big Collins's handwriting, but there was another one called Ernie O'Malley. And after months of research and intelligence, emails back and forth, however, they figured out that Ernie O'Malley was in fact Ernest Bernard Malley. And so this letter in the new edition of this book is written by the OC of Dublin Castle to British officer commanding London Whitehall. Please advise if you would forward this document to East Africa, where Lieutenant Frank Malley is working for us, and inquire if he has any knowledge as to where his rebel brother might be. It was causing us painful grief, and we would like to be in touch. Anyway, and of course, at this time, guess where Ernie O'Malley is? Down in the basement. They just don't know. His name is Bernard Stewart at the time. Anyway, Father Mike Collins finds out where he is. He's kicked out to Kilmainham. Very sadly, Paddy Moore does not agree to come out with Simon Donnelly and Frank Teeley at the time that Father escapes on February 14, 1921. But anyway, they get out. And at that time, they are, as I mentioned before, the IRA command is reorganizing brigades into divisions, and they have 16 divisions. Father, at one point, and I'm glad he didn't get the command, and before he went down to Kilkenny, he was offered the command by Mulcahy to take over the martial law area. Now that martial law area would have included all of Cork, Kerry, Limerick, Tipperary, and Waterford. Far too big an assignment for any one person. I think they figured that out, and what they did, they divided the Southern Division into 3 divisions. So Liam Lynch got the 1st division, Ernie O'Malley got the 2nd division, and Mick McCormack, I believe, got the 3rd division. So it was 3 people in a row. As Father goes around in his records, which I get to later, he had 3 columns in his notebooks. So he would be asking the battalion commander, how many people do you have? Well, yeah, we have 25. And how many are sort of appear occasionally, which are now really down to 20. And how many are actually active? Well now, Your Honour, maybe it's 15. So again, these numbers vary, and I don't know where history is going to come up. I'm not going to really study it. But by the time that numbers get established in July of 1921, there are a lot of people called trucers who come in to join up after all the fighting. But I mean, I'm not going to dismiss trucers. They joined, that's fine, and they would have fought had there been another fight. And maybe it was an age gap, maybe it was something else. But you're talking about a substantial number of people. Anyway, I mentioned Kilmainham. This is the monk shot. One of the reasons that there are very few photographs of Ernie O'Malley was he didn't like cameras, and because once your photograph is out there, and it's called publicity these days, you can get known, and he didn't want to be known. But so here's the gate that he escaped by. It's those of you who made the tour out there. I was on the tour last year. I thought it was very effective what Kilmainham had done with their heritage. I remember the days of the Restoration Committee, with trees going up through those buildings, and now they've made it into a classy joint where you can really experience history. They have a marvelous museum that goes with it. And there's the gate that he got through. Now, to get through the gate, he had to cut the bolts. And the two Welsh guards brought in bolt cutters that Michael Collins, or perhaps it was the 3rd Battalion of the engineers that got him the bolt cutters. Anyway, and the bolt cutters are now in the National Museum on Collins Barracks, if you want to go see them. And the note that Simon Connolly wrote to the OC of the 3rd Battalion says, Teeling Stewart, because he was known as Stewart, and I have escaped. It was dated February 14, 1921. He gets out. He's appointed the officer commanding of the 2nd Southern Division. He goes down, has a lot of work to do, and suddenly there is this surprise of getting the message that there's going to be a truce. Now, these lads have been working hard. They've got a new regime. They have their local command established. They have getting their guns together. They're getting things organized. There is a difference between what you call a headquarter IRA and division IRA. The division are the working people. I mean, the people working in the sense that they're actually doing the fighting as opposed to giving orders from the headquarters. I'm not saying headquarters in any group isn't important, but one of the reasons that as you look into what happens at the treaty, and you find who is pro-treaty and who is anti-treaty, what is the rationale behind that? You'll find, if you look at the map of Ireland, for those who you've seen, you'll find, let's call it green and some other color. The green is down the countryside, with the exceptions of Clare, who was pro-treaty, and Donegal, which was pro-treaty. The rest are basically anti-treaty. These are people who, like Fowler, have been fighting, have driven the RIC out of the hills and down into the towns like Mallow and others. They have seen the British troops be on the run. So they fail within their own local area, but they've had great success. All they need is a little bit more time and they'll get them out. Now, these are not people who know what, let's say, the opinions of the Dublin people are. We're not trying to be on sides here, trying to be level-minded. But the Dublin people also know, they've added up the numbers of how many people there are total, what the British troops are that are coming in, how many guns and what the ammunition supply is to the IRA. And people like Collins, with his intelligence group, is making a judgment as he goes through and looks at what is happening in the treaty as to whether the continuation of an armed revolution could be sustained at the level that it had been acted, and also what is it that the British Empire could do to that activity. So what I look at is these people in headquarters, whether they made the right or wrong decision, you need to think about why they made the decision. And it isn't too difficult to understand that they were, and you know, we all know that what the treaty was defended as saying is it's the first steps to a republic. Well, you know, people could say that because they felt we're going to run out of ammunition. Better make a truce now and a permanent one, and then let's go about building our own country. So basically, what happens between July and 21 is that debate is going on. People down the country, like Ernie O'Malley and others, when they hear of the treaty, they suddenly say, no, this is not what we have. We have a republic, we have a Doyle, we have representatives, we have people on the run, we know what's happening, and we'll rather go down with the ship. Now, you know, if everyone went down with the ship would be wrecked. I'm not saying what side anyone should be on that, but I mean, and Father's view throughout his life, he doesn't want to surrender the forecourts when he's asked to. He doesn't want to, he runs out of the house and he's shot almost dead, rather than, so he is a man who, with this responsibility of action, those words, remember? He wants to take action and be seen as taking action. And he's hoping that everyone else will take action. And the fact that they do or do not is really up to them. So you have to think of what's happening in 22 on two levels, militarily and politically. So militarily, there's a division within the IRA based upon the grounds that I mentioned as to what the attitude is going to be, whether Ernie is going to join in, he's asked to participate by his bosses, who are senior to him, to participate in a committee with those people who are going to go Free State eventually, but they don't know who's going to go where. Is just sit down and talk to them. Let's see how it should be done. Who's going to have what position within the army? Father has none of them. It's just like he rejected De Valera when De Valera offered, the minute De Valera offered the document number 2, many Republicans said, no way. We are not going to have an association with the British Empire. We are not going to take any oath. That's not why we fought. So, one might say, well, those are very peremptory words, but again, responsibility for action, this is where we stand, and you see interesting words about democracy on an old man's room. Father would be after the view that you don't ask the people where we should go, you lead the people and hope that the people will follow. So if you establish a republic, then people will accept the fact that you have a republic. They either do or they don't. And when they don't, then you don't have a republic. But hopefully, and what happened in 1919 was the Irish people started to support the concept of a republic. Anyway, leading up to the forecourts, there's a whole round of activities going on. He's appointed director of organization. The Dublin Brigade takes over the forecourts. They want to have a symbol of what their strength and capacity can be. They know that the Free State is starting to take over not only Dublin Castle, but all of the military establishments here in Dublin, from barracks and other things. So they are not going to get possession of those barracks because the handover is from the British to the senior management of the army. So they pick a symbolic building like the forecourts. It's symbolic because I don't think, in all honesty, any of the Republicans wanted it to be attacked or thought that it could be defended. But inevitably, it becomes very complicated in that month of June 1922. Father is in the forecourts. The forecourts is attacked. Of the senior IRA leaders on the Republican side at that point, there are very few people who have had military experience. So they ask this very junior fellow, Ernie O'Malley, will you please defend the forecourts? And he does what he can. After 3 days, it was shambles. And he is a spirit that they should surrender, and Father refuses to surrender. And finally, Joe McKelvey, who was Chief of Staff, the IRA at that time, orders my father to surrender the forecourts, and then he refuses still. And there's yet another huddle, and they said, you know, who's going to do it, me or you? And the father accepts responsibility for the action as ordered by his senior officer. Now, there was a lot of luck in Father's life because I mean, he survived many things, and he survives this one thing. And what does the Free State do with 200 soldiers, you know, on a Friday afternoon in heavy traffic at 4 o'clock on June 30th, 1922? Well, there's no place to put them. Oh, God, what should we do? So, isn't Jefferson's still right down there? Right, so march away. So Daly has my father march down to Jameson Distillery. They open the doors and they walk in and close the doors and put a couple of Stater troops around them and all scratching their head. Now what do we do? Well, Father and Sean Lamass and a couple of the lads are standing against the wall, and Lamass is trying to figure out what's anything loose here. Oh, here's an open door. Ernie, you know, we can get out here. And he says, well, don't tell anyone. So about three or four of the lads just drop out. And they say to the manager and his wife, who are looking out the window, say, oh, excuse me, we're just going through. We're in a bit of a rush. Don't mind me. Oh, go right ahead. And he opens the other door, and they're out on the street. And of course, he closes the first door because if anyone followed them, then they'd all be caught. So lo and behold, I mean, the irony of Father's life at this point, a junior officer doesn't get one of the senior ranks. Everyone else is locked up. So guess what? When Liam Lynch wants to appoint somebody, there's not too many people to appoint because they're all in the forecourts and now all off in Mountjoy jail. And some people are done. So Father is appointed the assistant Chief of Staff of the anti-treaty groups. So he is now turning 24, and he's given command of Ulster Province and Leinster Province. So that's his primary duty, and he was also Assistant Chief of Staff, so he has the rest of Ireland also to run jointly with Lynch. Anyway, and in effect, I mean, remember by this time in 1922, the countryside is quite divided, and along the sides of that map that I mentioned earlier. But the Republicans, you know, a lot of people found they listened to the elections, the result of the elections. Now, historians look at those elections and sort of say, well, you know, Republicans only got 35% of the vote. Well, Republicans sort of have different views of that, which you can sort of say, well, we didn't know what the Constitution was going to say because it was only published 4 hours before the polls opened. Well, in any case, whatever the anti-treaty position it was not going to get a plurality of the people. Between those people who were Free State who would never change and the Labour Party who would have continued to be on a free acceptance of the Free State, it was not likely that on a political level that the IRA was going to get over 50% of the people vote. But down the country, the senior management was locked up. Divisions were splitting yet again because now another crucial element was coming in. We are at war. And again, historians will decide what the numbers are. A lot of people had family feuds. I talked to a couple of people in the last days. President Higgins has a family feud on the front. One side of the family is Free State, the other is not. And so some people within that range of spectrum just withdraw. And they say, we are not going to participate in that. So there's an awful lot of withdrawal on both sides. On the other hand, you know, if you had been sentiment of being anti-treaty, you're not going to get employed. So employment was a big issue. Eventually, what happens is he's back on the run as Assistant Chief of Staff. He decides to make his headquarters here in Dublin. There's no office. He's on the run from one building to another. People are trying to chase him with messages, trying to organize a revolution and an army. It was pretty difficult. And I published a book called No Surrender Here, and you can see the mess of activities within the anti-treaty side. And you can also see within the next couple of months, the Free State was very smart. They sent troops down by ship to Cork, to Kerry, came into Westport. People landed, and they basically outflanked and outmaneuvered the Republicans. So between Liam Lynch and Ernie O'Malley, they certainly didn't do a good job on their military strategy. The underlying factor was people were being picked up. You know, this is a civil war where everyone, you now have paid people on the Free State. I mean, they're paid, meaning they're the RIC, the Garda Síochána who get paid, or the Free Staters who get paid and have a salary, have a permanent job. The IRA are still unpaid. And so eventually, 14,000 of them are rounded up. So Father is, by the time November comes, he again has a no-surrender moment. He defends a house on Aylesbury Road by the Humphreys, the O'Reillys, and is basically locked up, severely wounded, put into, he's now about to be shot because he is caught with guns. This is in a state of war. Erskine Childers is caught about 10 days after Father is, and because he has a gun on him and is not injured, he gets executed. Father is with a gun, and in killing people, he actually kills a person in that compound that he's living in as he's trying to get out of it. And so he's killed somebody and he's with a gun. But because he's so severely wounded, the image of James Connolly comes back, and they say, the Free State say, you don't shoot someone until you go through the procedure of having a certificate from a doctor sort of saying that you're okay to get shot. Father was, ironically enough, the man who Ewan O'Connor, is Ewan here tonight? Anyway, Ewan's father was a classmate of Father at UCD. They were going through medical school together. He becomes a doctor, and he takes the possession of the Free State. And he's the doctor in charge of Ernie O'Malley. He's told to go see if he's ready to be shot. And he signs these certificates every week or whatever that he's not ready to be shot. And Father is furious with his classmate because he wants to be shot, so to speak. I mean, this is, again, the Cuchulainn, the heroic, the image which comes up, which is you want to show your responsibility for action, and others will then follow what you have done if you're willing to do that. Anyway, needless to say, I wouldn't be talking to you here tonight if those actions had been hard. But he got served notice. He was going to be tried, but he didn't go through. Anyway, so look, he's 1923, he's severely wounded, he's in prison, he's elected to the Dáil. They go on a 41-day hunger strike, not a particularly successful one. Nothing changes at the end of it. I think one person dies and they call him off. And Father didn't want to go on the hunger strike in the first place because he didn't think it made sense. And he certainly didn't think that having 14,000 people go on hunger strike. You can't organize a strike with 14,000 people. They have different capacities. What you need for a hunger strike, you need 10 or 15 people who are competent, who are single-focused on mind, and will in fact die. And we had examples of that in the 1980s, where single-minded people were able to carry out their own centres. What happened to the 14,000 is they got pressured into it. Well, everyone on this floor is going to go on a hunger strike. It wasn't a matter of politics. Anyway, enough of that. He survives the hunger strike, and but here's a poster that was, the publicists on the outside are doing it. Ernie O'Malley, TD, because he's elected by that, is sinking fast. Anyway, he gets out in 1924, and he's one of the last people. And as he says at the end of the singing playing, we who had been beaten in the fight, who had stood the jail war, parted to take up the threads of inscrutable destiny. Some to begin life all over again. I mean, what do you do coming out? Your family may or not be proud of you. Your town, you come back to your town, which is torn apart because of things. Your friends have jobs because they didn't take action. You don't have jobs. So, again, I'm not sure what history says as to where those 14,000 people ended up, but I'm pretty sure an awful lot of them got on a boat to America or England within the next 2 or 3 years. So there's a tremendous Republican exodus from Ireland, simply for economic reasons. They can't get jobs. And in America, land of opportunity, you can start off again. So Father had a different view within the next 2 or 3 years. So there's a tremendous Republican exodus from Ireland, simply for economic reasons. They can't get jobs. And in America, land of opportunity, you can start off again. So Father had a different view. He couldn't work. His body wasn't working right. His eyes had been red hot pokers on. His feet had been trampled. He had a heart condition way back then. But he decides to start to build himself up. So he goes to Europe, to Barcelona first, to build up his strength, get into sun. And he meets a cobbler who can build him shoes, and he starts walking and climbing the Alps. And he spends sort of a year doing that. By the end of 1926, he's done that. He's also very much into the arts. He's taking great notes, writing diaries about everything that he sees. Then he comes back to UCD, goes into medical school, is still Sinn Féin. Remember what's happening back in Dublin here? Sinn Féin has this vote, which a certain party of people sort of say, look, let's be realists. Sinn Féin is never going to make it. We need to participate in the government of the day, and we need to sit in the Dáil in order that we can enact the legislation or oppose the legislation that is going on. And so the Sinn Féin vote, I don't have this clearly in mind, but it was something like 640 to 620, defeating the motion by Eamon de Valera that we should enter politics. So Sinn Féin continues with their 640 votes. Father is a Sinn Féin member and continues along that line. De Valera, Frank Aiken, and others withdraw, Sean Lamass, withdraw from the Sinn Féin, form the Fianna Fáil party, and says we will, given an opportunity, take the oath of allegiance, throw the Bible in the corner, and participate in government. And again, one needs to put that activity in perspective of this is the group which by 1932, only 6 years later, in fact gets into the power. So the philosophy of Fianna Fáil was, for whatever its principal reason, the philosophy was right. They got into power, and bit by bit, they were able to accomplish what Collins and others said, which was we will have the first step to the Republic. And the Fianna Fáil party through 38, 39, when they got control of the ports, stripped away the Governor-Generals, stripped away the appeal to the Privy Council. council stripped away various other elements, didn't accept the Constitution of 1937 refers to the island of Ireland rather than the 26 counties. So within their own system, they were stripping away all of that, which was what they called empire. Again, Father didn't particularly go along with that. What we find out, ironically enough, Dara wants to create a newspaper, the Irish Press, and wondering how can he get funding from America. People going to America for years, from the 19th century to the 21st century, people go to America to get funds. And so Ernie O'Malley is sent by, along with Frank Aiken, Dev's two generals, so to speak, are sent off to America to raise funds to create a free press. And Father goes off and works hard. They raise out of $500,000, goes into it. Eventually, by 1931, the Irish Press is created. Father is invited back to help run it, but he says enough is enough. I don't, go off and do it. He didn't want to become an editor or work with the group. By this time, he was trying to work on his own book, his memoir. In 1928, I found this in a Seattle newspaper. And it changed my whole attitude about the story that I'm telling, which is you find this young soldier who's raising funds, his military background, and suddenly he says, "My soul lies in the arts, in them lies happiness. I hope to be able to restore Ireland's interest in them. If I could, I would be a far greater reward than becoming the most famous surgeon." The minute I read that, it's sort of the rest of, the Ernie that I knew as my father wasn't a militarist, nothing more than that. I only knew of his sort of intellectual input. And this little phrase that I want to be in the arts made the rest of his life sense to me. Now, that just happened to be caught by a reporter in a newspaper. And I'm sure he didn't just make it up for that reporter. He had had that for some time. And as I've looked at the files in the Jackie Clark collection down in Ballina, you'll find Father's Tintoretto and other books of art that he signed in 1919. So he was running around the countryside with Francois Villon, books on poetry and art. And throughout the university days that he had in jail, where his reading list is an incredible reading list of modern literature and modern art. And you see how he was expanding and working on his own mind as he got through that. So this expression is something that he had for some time. But basically after this, he spends the rest of his life in the arts. He goes down to California, and because he's interested in them and he is a competent speaker, his relationship with Ford was sort of on a military basis, because Ford ultimately becomes an admiral during the Second World War. And so when they talk together in The Quiet Man and the other movies that he did in Ireland, Father is a friend who's a military strategist, and they're able to talk American Civil War, war in general. But he was able to do that. One of the things he was doing in America, he found out that Ella Young, the Irish poet, had gone to California and was a distinguished writer and published her own books in 1925-26. And Father wanted to meet her because she had been Irish and she'd gone to America and got published. And he was, meantime, trying to write this book on another man's womb. Now, look, those of us in the book business, you always want to see how do you do it? How do you get it done? What are the first steps? How do you pull this mass of information that you have? She found out that she was visiting in Taos, New Mexico. It so happened that Father was based in California at the time. How do I get to Taos, New Mexico? This is a guy who's penniless, doesn't have any money. Anyway, he meets a friend, the widow of Peter Nolan from Cork, he has his name, her name would have been on a list of De Valera's list of people in California to look up. So he looks her up, and she's got some children who want to see the Grand Canyon. So they say, okay, let's see the Grand Canyon, and let's keep driving to Taos, New Mexico. This is the car that they drove across, and in the diaries that he's driving, he says he can feel the bullets. I mean, these were not modern suspension cars, right? And he says he could feel the bullets scraping against the back of his back, which would not have been pleasurable. One of the things I thought was particularly relevant to where we are today, in his diaries in New Mexico, he writes something which I thought would be of interest. He has what I call an examination of his own conscience. I'll just read the end, because he's talking about what should he do. He doesn't have a visa, it's expired. You're pretty stupid, what off. Anyway, so he's sort of saying, why didn't you go back home? Because you've always said that emigration is a curse. And one should endeavor to remain. Yes, but I could not get work. Yes, I might have become a member of Parliament, £400 a year, but I would have to take an oath of allegiance. I might have applied for secretarial work in the Fianna Fáil, but their party are willing to take the oath. This is 1929. I might be able to apply for service and for a pension. That should give me £300 a year. But I do not believe in gratuities for service given. I might have joined the Free State Army. I could get £1,000 a year, but I would have had to work against my comrades. So I mean, those are the thoughts of somebody given this dilemma of what to do, and so he just decided, the comment is, I think you're a fool. Again, he's talking to himself, right? I think you're a fool. Foolishness is relative. I might think you are one. Anyway, I call my soul my home. So again, a very important part of Ernie's charisma or his own personal is feeling that he has his own integrity, responsible for his action, and he can decide whether what he is doing is reasonable or not. His purpose at that time was to write his story, and he does get his story written between New York and he does a lot of poetry and short stories and all that. He comes back ultimately. He spends a year in Mexico. That's a very interesting escapade too. But he comes back, and this is in the full depression, which starts in '29. He comes back to New York, meets Paul Strand, another good friend, returns to the East Coast, still hasn't got, no publisher has taken the book, so he's still rewriting it. And he writes The Singing Flame and the On Another Man's Road together as a unit. So this is, you're talking about 600 pages of pretty heavy story that people actually don't believe. There are stories, rejection letters, which says, this is fiction, it's not real. He hears that there's a pension, that he's eligible for a pension. He applies for the pension, and he finds that it might be. Then he meets this lady. Well, she could turn anyone's heart. My mother was quite a rascal. In her own mind, she was rejecting her family just the way that my father had rejected him. Rejecting in the sense, there are alternate ways of living. She was an artist, she stuttered, she didn't like the life that her societal family had coordinated for her, and she met a very refreshing character. Now, when this refreshing character was invited to dinner, unbeknownst to my mother, and my grandfather on the American side started talking to him. Remember, the talk was to a Catholic, to someone who hadn't finished. And this is an industrialist who's built his own little business. So here's this guy comes to dinner, and he's Catholic, he's a socialist, doesn't have a job, hasn't completed university, talks, wild stream, is sort of literate, and has wandered around America, hasn't done anything productive in his life. And he said, wow. So the grandfather calls the family together after that dinner party and says, Mr. O'Malley will not be returning. Well, now, the real reason that happened was the discussion apparently was relating to the Native American. And Mr. Hooker, my grandfather, had a view that Americans had treated the Native Americans fairly well. He didn't know much, so fairly well. And what Father had spent his 3 years out in New Mexico seeing the impact of the colonial American impact on the indigenous Native American, and found out that the Native American was the Irish in a certain environment in the Midwest, and had been equally mistreated. Not necessarily intentionally by an overall policy, but the effect of that policy was ruination for the Native Americans. So yes, there were all the characteristics that some Yankees might have referred to the Irish. And so this man who had built his own industry and was very prominent in his own world sort of said, look, I'm not going to fight. I don't like anyone who defends the Native Americans. So the fight actually was over Native Americans and the treatment of Americans out there. Anyway, he was disappointed. My mother was quite intrigued. She was a sculptor. Do you like the cut of that jib? Is that the expression? And asked him if he would sit for her. So the only clue that she had as to what he was going to do was they got together and they enjoyed it. He knew the art world which she wanted to speak. Not artiste, but just art in simple English. And they fell in love, and they decided to come back to Ireland. He arranged for the pension, came back. The book got published in 1936. He went back to medical school to have the appearance of, well, I think it was all well intended, to have the appearance of, for her family and for himself, and no doubt for the Malley family. The Malley family, Mrs. Malley was always asking, well, what's Ernie doing? It's very nice to have an excuse to go back to medical school. By this time, UCD had started a program in the arts. Father was one of the first students to go through the diploma in European art. And so he gets his diploma in 1937. At the same time, he's supposed to be finishing his medical studies, but he gets one wrong. Meantime, he's down the countryside. The book comes out. He's sued for libel. So he's pretty turned off by Dublin. I mean, and the Republican position by many of those left-outs at this point who haven't joined the system is disillusionment. It is not the state that they had fought for. The church had a certain role which they didn't intend it to have. The conservative nature of the Parliament became even more conservative. The arts didn't have the functionality within the institutions, and there was no support for it. So a lot of, guess who emigrates? Some of the greats. And some of those who stay here are pretty disillusioned. He's also into photography. He's known to some people in America. For him, photography is a very essential part of the art world. And he is very acute. If you read the book, you'll see how acute he is on detail, and the reason that he's able to be good at listening and looking at art is it's the attention to detail and how the perspective works. And you apply all of those same disciplines to photography. It's how you look at a statue or an image and how the light is shining on it. All these factors come into the art of photography. So here he is now these are my father's photographs of my mother's. There's some of them included in that book, Western Ways. And here's the farm down in Mayo. Beekeeping, he tries to do all the things that a farmer can do. He runs the farm like a military camp. He has no idea how to be a farmer. He thinks things are supposed to be on time. You know, he has no idea. So, you know, part of what happened when he was an organizer and he went down the country, I mean, people hated him. He writes about the attitude of the people working under him in the brigades, and they figured they hated him more than the British, you know, because at least they were sort of down the road. And he was ordering them, you know, don't march, tramping, all of this stuff. For what? To make a revolution. They couldn't see the connection between what the train was and what the objective was. He was trying to run the farm the same way. I have these farm notebooks, you know, Paddy is 10 minutes late. What the hell do you do? You're going to dog Paddy? No. He doesn't work. Anyway, they come back to Dublin, and one of the things that he writes a 3-volume concordance for Ulysses, which is one of the many fields that he got into. He becomes an editor for the Bell. I mean, he's sort of flourishing in a renaissance of activity. He supports Jack Yates and Louis Le Brocq. He helps found the Irish Exhibition of Living Art in 1943, in which my mother has pieces of sculpture there. So he's part of that whole group of people. But in the midst of all of this, he comes up with this idea, which isn't uniquely his, because other people were thinking of it at the time, which is recording this, either the statements or interviews of people who have worked as veterans during the wars. And he goes around and spends 5 of the next years, as he is in declining health, getting the record of people. And he interviews 450 people. And here you can see his early notes. The red is the people he's interviewed, the other people that he wants to get interviewed. He writes longhand very quickly during the interview, and then he goes into a second volume and rewrites. The rewriting is not much more legible than the first writing. I can assure you, you may have seen these books called The Men Will Talk to Me, and it was sort of my idea trying to get me done Kerry, Galway, Mayo, trying to get the word back to what I think returning history to the people, to give the grandchildren of these people, because the grandfathers never talked. They never told their wives, they never told their children what it was that they had gone through. But they told Ernie O'Malley because they knew that he had a certain capacity, a certain vigilance, and that he would treat their material in confidence. And so that was Fowler's great, I think, contribution to the history, not only in the literary side, but recording it. Here's the only photograph that exists of the family in 1947. Again, he had an aberration to it. The last 7 years of his life are really very sad. One of my books is called Broken Landscapes, which is, I collected, you know, my father died when I was 14, so I didn't really know him. So one of the things I tried to do was collect information about him and get his letters and see what he said in his letters. Now, you know, once I read the letters, I didn't need to know much because I know what he said. But anyway, people got after me, and I thought I would share these, and so I put the whole book together. And the question is, what do you call the book? I called the book Broken Landscapes, with a very sad fact that everything that my father touched broke. The Republic broke. The Free State, the oath, his health, you know, all of these issues, the book, you know, the treaty, the marriage, the farming, the libel suit. He had to sell his library because of finances. He had to sell his land because of finances. My mother kidnapped my brother and sister, so only I was left. So, I mean, basically throughout his life and his declining years, everything. A poor man. I mean, he really. But you know, he carried on. He still wanted to do, and I've recently got a letter which he had written to James Johnson Sweeney in 1951, and said, "I really want to get my book." He spent 3 years photographing medieval art sculpture around Ireland. If it's the last thing I want to do, I really want to get that book out. But he admitted that before he got that book out, he really had to do the book on the interviews with the men, because he owed it to them, he owed it to history, and they were dying. And so basically he spent his last couple of years trying to help give Irish history back to the people.
Something wrong away.